Greetings and welcome to a special Herald and News podcast on Saturday, August 18th, 2018. I'm Kurt Liedtke with the Herald and News. We are joined today by a Klamath Falls native, 90 years young, who for about 60 years now has carved out an incredible career as a film director, producer, and writer, Mr. James Ivory. He will be hosting a screening and Q&A of his Oscar-winning film, Call Me By Your Name, tonight at 6 p.m. at Pelican Cinemas, which last I heard there are still a few seats left. So for any people who want to attend, please go online to klamathfilm.org to reserve your seat or contact Pelican Cinemas. Mr. Ivory, thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule, and you're on vacation to join us. We appreciate it.
Well, I'm happy to be here and back in Klamath Falls.
And it's my understanding that you come back here every year. Now, why is it that you return home year after year?
Well, when we lived in Klamath Falls, which was from the early 30s until the late 40s, during that time, my father bought a cabin at Lake of the Woods. And we used to go up all the time from Klamath Falls, and I still go to that cabin. I come every August, and I now own the cabin, and friends of mine come with me, and they drop in, and there are not so many people anymore in Klamath Falls that I knew when I grew up because, well, that was a very long time ago. They're not around anymore, but there are still some, and I always see them, and they're fun to be with, and there's a little pull together, so.
Having grown up here in the 1930s and 1940s, I know anytime that I go home to Eugene, almost every time I return home, I say, hey, when did that get torn down? When did they build this? Hey, that's different. Every time you come back, do you spot something?
Yes, and with dismay, for instance, the Balsiger Motor Building with extraordinary Oregon version of the Temple of Karnak in Egypt, in ancient Egypt, that's gone. It was an incredible building. So I see these gaps.
Well, I am curious about growing up in Klamath Falls in the 1930s and 40s as you did, because Klamath back then was very different from what it is now. It was before the I-5 corridor was built, and now most traffic between California, Oregon, and Washington goes through Medford, not here. Back then, Klamath Falls was the main stop that people made when they were traveling north and south. And that resulted in a pretty lively downtown scene with multiple theaters for films and live shows and neon wall to wall. It was basically the Oregon equivalent of Las Vegas. So having been exposed to that growing up here, how much of an influence did that have on your pursuit in the entertainment industry?
I love going to the movies, and I started going when I was 5, and I can remember exactly that experience of seeing the first film. And there were several first-run theaters in Klamath Falls. The most wonderful one, and the biggest and grandest, was the Pelican Theater, which has been torn down. There's nothing there but a car park now. But anyway, I went constantly to the movies, and no one ever, I was never told not to go to a particular movie. I just pretty much did what I wanted, and my parents were okay with that. I remember being taken out of Gunga Din once, the only time I was ever taken out of a movie as a child, because it was thought to be too violent. And I remember being dragged up the aisle of the theater, but looking back at the screen to see what was going to happen. But I just went to every movie that I wanted to see, and also there were theaters in Klamath Falls that played didn't play new films or the second runs. There was one called The Rainbow, and you could see all sorts of things there. And there was a theater that just played cowboy films, and so on. So that had a big effect on me.
Did you have a favorite growing up, maybe genre or actors that every time something came out,
Not so much actors, I think really for a long time actors, they were all the same to me. There was nobody especially until I became an adolescent that I began to think I really like that person. I very much liked historical films because I've always been interested in history. I liked big films that were historical, like Gone with the Wind, but then I also, loved films like The Wizard of Oz, which was playing at the Pine Tree. I remember I went to see it 4 times. I remember I was a student. I went to the Sacred Heart Academy, and I remember the nuns warning us about going to see Gone with the Wind. And I remember one of our teachers saying, "You must put your hands over your ears when Clark Gable says, 'Frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn.'" We were not supposed to listen to that; it might corrupt us. But anyway, I was here all those years, and there were a lot of wonderful films then.
At what point, because I know you graduated from Klamath Union High School in 1946. You attended the University of Oregon. Go Ducks. I'm from Eugene. And then you also went to USC. At what point did you start thinking, you know what, I might want to pursue this as a career instead of just being a fan of film?
I think that came around came about along when I was probably about 15, and it wasn't to be a director. At that time, I didn't even know what a director was or a producer was. But what interested me was the idea of becoming a set designer. And I've always been interested in buildings and interiors and as I say, in history, and that's what prompted me to take up the idea of going on and making a career. And well, you didn't, at that age, you don't think of careers. I mean, I didn't. But we knew an architect here in Klamath Falls, a wonderful architect named Sheldon Brumbaugh, and he was doing some work on our house. And I said, when I was about 15 or 16, what would be the best thing for me to do to go on to become a set designer after high school, and when I go to college, where should I go, and what should I be doing? And he said, go to architectural school. So I thought, fine, and that's exactly what I did. So after I graduated from KUHS, I went to the University of Oregon to the School of Architecture and Fine Arts there, and Allied Arts it was called. And I took architecture for 3 years, and then eventually I began to take many more art courses, painting and printmaking and ceramics, all sorts of things. And at the end of that, when I graduated, I then wanted to go to the USC Film School because by that time I realized there were such things as film schools. And so I did.
Okay. Now, there's a great cliche about Hollywood and people moving from small towns. They're thinking that all I have to do is show up in Hollywood, someone's going to give me that big break, and I'm going to make it. I think the streets of Hollywood, having lived there for 12 years myself, are paved with the crushed dreams of countless thousands who have come there and then left with their tail between their legs. Everyone who has had any kind of success there, no matter how short or long, inevitably got that first big break. Someone took a chance on them, and then they worked on some project and paid their dues to work their way up. What was that first project that you got to work on that was like, wow, I'm actually in Hollywood doing this?
I didn't think like that.
Okay.
And you know, streets, the streets of crushed spirits and dreams that went bad and so forth. That's really New York, and the same thing, the same situation exists in New York. And I went after USC Film School. I moved to New York City right out of college, and I've been there ever since. So I never really was. I didn't really have my feet there in Hollywood as such. But an extraordinary thing happened. With our first feature film, the first Merchant Ivory film, made in India, was actually bought by Columbia Pictures for worldwide distribution, which was an amazing thing to have happen. It was an Indian film with all Indian actors, pretty much. And it was produced by Ismail Merchant, who was my partner, and written by Ruth Prawer, who then became our screenwriter for 25 films or something of the sort. And it was then, what is now Sony, was then called Columbia, and they released the film all over, and they paid us for that film to buy the rights. They paid us in Indian rupees because all the big American movie companies had millions of dollars in India in the banks because they couldn't take it out because of the problem there with it just wasn't possible to take your earnings out of India. You had to just leave them there, and hopefully you could do something with them. So they paid us for the Householder in rupees, and we then and Householder was not what you'd call a box office success. It was quite liked, but it was not nowhere was it a box office success. And they did release it all over the world, or wherever they released films, let's say. But the money that we got from them, we put into a new film, which was Shakespeare Walla, our second Indian film, and that became a big hit. Certainly a big critical hit. And then we were kind of on our way, you could say.
So how did that collaboration start? Most people who are fans of film know the name Merchant Ivory Productions now, but everything has a foundation. Now, 40 plus films later, it's well established. But how did you begin collaborating between Ishmael and Ruth?
It was Ismail who, when Ismail came here, he went straight to Hollywood. And he'd made a film, a dance film, an Indian dance film in New York. He went to NYU, the NYU Business School, and then he met some people, and they all got together and made a documentary on Indian dance. And Ismail was determined to get that nominated for an Academy Award. And he's the kind of person who could do something like that, who could think like that. Most people wouldn't think like that. And he went off to California with that film, and he did get it nominated. And it was that year, 1961. There it was. But while he was there, someone gave him the book The Householder to read. And so he thought that would be, he would like to make that into a film. And people were saying, you must make it, or the person who gave him the film said, the book said, you must make this into a film. And it's a really wonderful writer and all of this. And Ismail came back to that very soon. And we went to Ruth Prawer and asked her if we could buy her book or the rights to her book for a film, and asked her also whether she would write a screenplay. And she said, well, I've never written a screenplay. And Ismail said, well, Jim has never directed a movie either. And I've never produced a movie, but what about it? And she said, well, all right. And that's how we started out, sitting around a table in Delhi in 1961.
So from that initial conversation, did you ever have any inclination that 60 years later, Merchant Ivory Productions, 44, 45 films, something like
yeah.
that?
No.
In any concept at all that from those early conversations it would turn into this?
No, of course not.
Of those early projects that you worked on, the whole, paying your dues phase or early on, looking back on your career, you've held jobs where you did kind of a little bit of everything in the filmmaking process. You've done from appearing as an actor a couple times to producing, directing, editing, even costume design a couple of times. Was that just simply out of necessity?
Some of that, I never was a costume
Oh,
designer. I was. I was a costume designer for a marvelous ballet that was produced in Florence.
Okay.
That I did, for a ballet that was being choreographed by Carol Armitage. I was the set designer and the costume designer for that only. And if you're a director, you can't help but also be something of a writer. I mean, you have to write stuff all the time. Things come up and the screenwriter's not there, and you have to give your actor something to say, or they can't say something that you've written, and so you have to give them something else to say. So I've been a writer, and having been a documentary filmmaker and worked in an editing room on 3 documentaries of my own, I was something of an editor, not really a real editor. I could not be an editor for a feature film. I didn't have that experience, but I knew what it was like to edit a film, and I knew the sort of things that I was looking for. So I was that too. And later on, I couldn't help but be, because of my interest in design and in movie sets and so forth, I couldn't help but be something of a critical eye on my film sets. I made them do things that I wanted and stopped doing things I didn't want, that kind of thing. I always got into it. But a lot of directors are like that. It's not unusual. You get a taste of almost everything.
It seems the larger the production, the more hands are involved in something. When you do those smaller projects or when you're starting out, you maybe have more control because out of necessity, you're kind of doing everything, right? So,
Yeah.
so at what point had it developed to where you established the trust in various crews? You're like, you know what, they can handle that. I don't need to pay close attention to the sets or the
No, you
costumes.
do.
Okay.
You have to pay close attention to everything. You have to, everything at least that's seen and heard. You have to. If you don't, you're going to, there'll be some awful thing and you can't change it. So I think that it started right at the beginning. I mean, I just realized I have to be there for everything.
There's a certain style to your films. Early on, you did a lot of films that were set in India, and you've really become well known for making films based on classic English literature. There's a term that sometimes has a negative connotation in the filmmaking industry of being typecast. But I always feel like, you know what, if you're really good at something, why not pursue that? What drew you to the particular types of genres of films that you have made?
Well, there are all kinds of things if you think about it. I mean, a lot of we didn't really start doing adaptations until the late 70s when we did our first literary masterpiece, you could say, which was which was Henry James' The Europeans. And that was where we began. And then after that, I mean, just one's reading makes you, you read something and it seems like that would be a great thing to make it to a film for all kinds of reasons. I mean, or you have other reasons. For instance, I wanted to make A Room with a View, not just because I liked the story and it was a delightful story, but I hadn't been in Italy, a place which I love. I hadn't been in Italy for 20 years because I was spending all this time in India. And I thought, I just have to make a film in Italy. And that's really how A Room with a View came about. And that led to my involvement, you could say, with the English. I had never really, I'd been to Europe a lot when I first started out, when I first started going to Europe when I was 22. But I never had much interest in the English. People are amazed at this, but I didn't. And I had very little interest in going to England, and I almost never did go. But I went to other places. I went to France and to Italy, and particularly, and of course we were making American films. People don't realize how many American films we've made, but we have. And they were on all sorts of subjects, some of them were sort of literary, some were not. We made a weird musical, which is called a sort of dark musical with Raquel Welch and Jimmy Coco about Hollywood in the 20s. People don't even know about that film. So we did all sorts of, and that was based on a poem. So we did all kinds of things. But why people think of us and why we've gotten typecast is because our biggest hits were English, set in England and based on very, very, very good English books, either by Ian Forster or by Kazuo Ishiguro. And those were the films that people think about and remember and saw and were huge hits in some cases.
So since there is a style that is most known for Merchant Ivory Productions, these adaptations of classical literature, I always have trouble saying that word for some reason. Have you ever thought, you know what, I just really want to go the polar opposite. I want to make like a teen screwball comedy, or Marvel, pass me $250 million to make the next superhero summer blockbuster.
I've been asked that question so many times. I never wanted to do that. I just wanted to do my particular kind of story. And why do you do this? You do it because of the pleasure it gives you. That is the only real reason that anybody who works in any field of art, that's the only reason you do it. It's because you enjoy doing it. Now, I would not have enjoyed doing something like that. I would have stayed away from it. It was not my idea of fun. My idea of fun is something else. So that is really what sent me along my particular path, was the idea of having a good time.
So in that concept of doing something that you're passionate about, what people often forget when it comes to the entertainment industry, be it music, film, TV, you're making something creative and artistic, but there's also a commercial aspect to it. So there's always this push-pull in terms of creativity versus commerciability. How difficult is that in the production process in terms of not only telling a story the way that you want to present it, but also thinking, will this draw an audience? Does that ever come into play in terms of the production?
It could have. I mean, but it really never did in any kind of meaningful way. I was always allowed, I was respected, we were respected for doing the kinds of things we did. And no one ever tried to mess around with our films except Harvey Weinstein on 2 occasions. And on both of those occasions we beat him, and he did not touch our films. In fact, on one of them we took his name off. So that's the only time that if anyone came to sort of get in my hair.
Well, with all the productions that you've done, I've found, having spent some time in the entertainment industry myself before I came to the Klamath Basin, that oftentimes the more interesting story than the finished project is how it goes about getting made. The actual film process, from early script to screen, the funding, some of the weird and bizarre things that can happen on set, and when getting to locations, and just trying to problem solve when something totally unpredictable happens and figuring, okay, how are we going to get this done? From all the films you've made, is there a specific event that maybe happened on set or in the course of a production where, looking back on it now, it's kind of funny, but at the time you're like, oh man, how are we going to deal with this?
Well, we have had problems. On our 3rd film, which was an Indian film called The Guru, in fact, which was funded by 20th Century Fox. On the first day of photography, the star of the film, who was an Indian, was arrested and taken to prison. And he stayed in prison for 10, 12 days, and we shot other scenes. And then finally we were able to spring him from the prison. All kinds of amazing things were done to get him out, and he did get out. I mean, when something like that happens, what do you do? But we got him out somehow, just through connections. And he was a violent kind of communist agitator, but a very, very good actor. And he was playing a musician in our film. And when he went to prison, he took his sitar with him and practiced on the sitar for the film while he was in prison. And then he got out and we went on. Now we've had things like that. And then we've had other things which were, when we were making Morris, we had a French cameraman, but his camera crew was English. And somehow he didn't get on with him, or they didn't get on with him. The idea to these English guys that there was this French cameraman on a film being made in England about an English subject, it rankled with them, and they up and left. And what were we to do? And it was on a day when a particularly difficult scene was being shot, which was a very dramatic scene, and the actors were entirely ready to do it. And then what happens? The camera crew leaves. We had to get a new camera crew, and somehow, in a few hours, we did manage to get a new camera crew that came down from London, and we were able to go on. So we've had those kinds of things, and there are probably many other types of things like that. I remember them, but you just have to get on with it.
Sure. Somehow just make it happen, right?
Right.
I think most people understand what the role of a director is, but I don't think a lot of people really understand what a producer does on a film. You've done just as much producing and production work as you have as directing. So what does that job entail?
Well, it's getting it all to happen, and to getting the whole thing going. I mean, a producer has to, first of all, find the money and hopefully find a distributor for the film. He has to convince actors, agents, and actors that they ought to be acting in that particular film and take this role that you're offering them. He has to be on top of all of the sort of all of the way the film is made in terms of the kind of camera equipment that you have to rent, and sound equipment, and the various artists that are going to do particular kinds of things, and the hiring of like the cameraman, the hiring of the production designer, the costume designer, the composer. All those things are the domain of the producer. I mean, obviously he works with you well, Ismail always worked with me, and we, nothing was ever, I was never presented with something I didn't like. Now, sometimes he went further than you normally think a producer, or most directors would think a producer ought to go, and he would cast somebody and not tell me about it. And then I would learn that he, in fact, had cast Maggie Smith, Who's to Complain, James Mason, Who's to Complain, things like that. But he went off on his own, because there's a certain amount of dithering that goes on. Directors, you haven't made up your mind, and is it this or is it that, or will I like her or will I like him, all this sort of thing. How will they look, all this stuff. And Ismail was the kind of person who would go out and say, well, forget all that, and go out and go to Maggie Smith and dangle a script in front of her. He happened to know someone who knew her, and so he lay in wait for her outside her dressing room at a London theater, and went in with the script, and she said yes. So who's to complain when he did that?
I'm curious on your perspective of the filmmaking process. Having been involved in the film industry for so long, I find it fascinating the advancements in technology that have come along just in the last few years, the way that now drones are being used in film production, all special effects, computer graphics, all new types of cameras that have come out. But the method of storytelling through film has remained relatively unchanged since the silent movie era a century ago, when guys like Charlie Chaplin and Buster Keaton and Harold Lloyd were basically creating how films are being made. How has the film making process for you changed over the time of your career, and how has it really remained the same?
Well, you still have to, you need basic things. You've got to have a very good story, a really good story that makes sense. There's not some meaningless thing that's totally unreal. At least I have to have that. Then you have to have very, very good actors to present that story. And pretty much if you can get those two things, and if you can have a visual look, if you can get you have to have a very, very good cameraman that you work with. And if you have those basic things, you are probably going to have a pretty good movie. Now, that doesn't mean that the public's going to like it. They may not. It may be boring to them, or it's just not a story that interests them. But if you have a good story, and very often the best stories are, in fact, by authors who wrote extraordinary books, which are just lying around for you to just put your hand on and take and make into a film if you want to. If you've got that kind of a story, you pretty much will be okay. But if you have a weak story and bad actors and visually the film is a mess, it's not going to be good. But let me just say this. Yes, there's been the most extraordinary development in film technique over the last 20 years, 25 years. Incredible things can be done now that could hardly be imagined 20 years ago, because of the new techniques of all sorts of digital things and just so much stuff. But what I feel that the great films are still to come, because we have now really perfected this extraordinary technique of making films. But what we need are the visionary directors who are going to come up with superb stories. And when in the future there are going to be these directors, and there have always been visionary directors, and they're going to come again. They're in short supply right now, I think, but they will be there, I assure you. They're going to make the new films, the great films of the future. They're going to make all the films of the past look like daguerreotypes or tintypes would look. They may have been beautiful, but they're nothing to compare with what they're going to be. This is what I feel. And people come and say, "Oh, movies, they've just gone downhill. It's not. There's not going to be anything anymore, and I'm giving up and all this." Don't. Because I think the films of the future, because of an enormous increase of the possibilities through the technical areas of filmmaking, and as I say, but you have to have some visionary directors.
At a certain point, it's just like new toys to play with, right? So,
Absolutely true. Yeah.
I could see how certain people may want to try a new technology when it's out for the sake of trying it. But have you ever tried to embrace new things for the sake of trying out a new tech, or is it important to kind of just, you know what, this is the story and we're going to tell it in the best
No,
way?
we have. There have been times when we had to do some things and we didn't know how to do them, and we had to invent things in some cases that other people eventually, used them and found them useful. So no, we have.
I spent a few years working in Hollywood myself, and I got to work on a lot of projects that I'm very proud of. Some projects became huge hits, some were complete and total flops. And some of the things that I'm most proudest of, almost no one ever saw or heard. Unfortunately, that's just the way things work out. You make a project and you put your heart and soul into it, and you think that it's something great, but it's still up to the audience to determine if they like it or not. You can't force someone to like a certain song or a certain
Right.
TV show or film. Has there been projects where you thought, when it's all said and done, wow, this thing's going to be awesome, it's going to win all these awards, and then just...
I've never thought like that, ever. I've never thought like that. And I'll never forget, after we finished editing Howard's End, which became maybe our biggest hit, Ruth Prawer, the writer, and I were walking up at night. At my house in the country where we edited. We were walking up to the house at night, and she said, "Well, it is what it is." About Howard's End. Well, Howard's End, I just assumed it would be like all other movies. Maybe people would like it and maybe it'd get good reviews, but it wouldn't make any money. Well, it surprised us. It was what it was, and became this huge hit all over the world. And but you don't. I've never thought optimistically about our films being huge hits. In fact, but I'm not pessimist either. But I never thought about awards and things of that kind.
There comes a certain point when, and I've seen it firsthand in recording studios and having worked in the music side of Hollywood for quite some time, where people can get stuck feeling like a project is never actually done, and they're just recording like the same track 50 times over, thinking, no, it's not absolutely perfect, we have to do it again and again and again. And at some point, you just kind of have to tell people, step away from the board, it's good enough.
Mm-hmm.
There are some filmmakers, I can think of George Lucas comes immediately to mind, who go back and keep tweaking their finished projects. Do you ever get to a point where you're like, looking back, man, I wish I'd spent a couple more days working on that, or do you ever say, okay,
if you make a low budget film, and most of our films, even when they were studio films, were low budget films, you don't have that luxury of doing that. You just have to get on with it. And it's not, yes, I've heard of famous actors like Marlon Brando saying one word 50 times and he never liked it. We couldn't do that. We didn't have the money to do that kind of thing. We couldn't go on and on and on in a recording studio for 2 days to get a one sentence perfect. And so in a way, making low budget films it has a sort of powerful constraint on you in that kind of area of filmmaking. So that you cannot be that kind of a perfectionist. And anyway, you're listening to someone else's idea of what is perfect. You may think, well, he said, oh, in a perfectly fine way 10 times. Why must we be doing it another 50 times? You just have to get in and stop.
Call Me By Your Name is the most recent project that you've released. It came out last year, and you initially were slotted, if I remember correctly, to direct, and then you ended up being the screenwriter. How did you get involved in that project?
Well, I had some neighbors in upstate New York where I live who had bought the screen rights for the novel. And they were having problem finding someone to direct it, and they came to me and asked me to become an executive producer on it because they thought if I was associated with it, with our sort of history of making good low-budget films, and particularly in Europe, that I would help them to raise the money. Well, finally, they did get an Italian director who wanted to do it, Luca Guadagnino, but he thought that maybe he and I should direct it together because being Italian, I think he felt a little uneasy about making a film that was mostly in English, and I, being an English speaker, was a little uneasy about having. I mean, I had to write scenes in Italian and so forth, or get them translated and all that kind of thing. So we were going to do it together. Now that's never allowed in Hollywood. By the Directors Guild, you just don't. You don't. Two people don't make a film together. Usually, and then it turned out that he decided, no, he just wanted to do it on his own, and that was okay with me. But during the period when I was going to also direct with him, I said, well, there was already a script, and I said, I want my own script. I'm going to do my own script. And so I did. And for 3-4 months, I wrote a new screenplay for that film. And then that's the one they raised the money on, and that's the one they used to make the film. And so I became the screenwriter. Now, it was not the first time I'd been the screenwriter. I had written, that was the 7th film on which I had been a screenwriter that was produced of ours. So this was not a first-time thing for me, except that I was alone this time in doing it. No one was working with me. I didn't have Ruth Prawer. I didn't have anybody else writing it with me. I was all alone. And somehow, I don't know, I was enjoying myself. I loved the idea of making a film in Italy. I love Italy so much and wanted to be there all the time. So that was really what drew me to the thing, as well as the story. In fact, it was a film being made in Italy.
The writing process itself, when you're adapting from an established story, and I know that's something that you've done throughout your career, but there's always the argument, the book versus the film, and people say, well, if you read the book, don't see the movie because you're going to be disappointed because the film can never include everything that the book does, just in certain terms of time-wise. What difficulties come into adapting the story from an established novel? And when you come into the screenplay process, knowing there's things that we can include and there's things that we're going to have to cut just for the sake of time for the film, how do you go about trying to adapt a story to screen from?
Well, you wouldn't be doing the story. You wouldn't be making that film or writing a script if you didn't like the story, and if you didn't like the tone of the writer. I mean, the tone of the writer, of the original author, has a lot to do with how you look at what you're doing as a screenwriter. I mean, you have to keep that tone. It's crazy to take a story by a wonderful writer with a particular style and then totally distort that. And why do it? I mean, so you feel what is right and what is not right, but you have to maintain the tone that the original author had created, but that doesn't mean you can't make big cuts or invent things of your own. But you do it within the sphere of that particular work of art that already exists on page. I mean, that's how I did. I mean, there were big cuts we made in Call Me by Your Name. We dropped the whole last. There was a big chapter in which the story went on, and then the two young men were approaching middle age practically, and I didn't want any of that. I thought let's end the story when they're happy and young, and so that's what we did. I just cut the whole end of the film, and other things of that kind you have to do.
Well, apparently it was a good choice because you won the Academy Award for Best Screenplay, and Call Me by Your Name was also nominated for many other awards. Collected, if I remember correctly, collected around 90 film awards, and was even nominated for Best Picture of the Year. Now, I know you're no stranger to awards. Throughout your 60-plus year career, you've collected Kennedy Center honors and Lifetime Achievement. Oh,
no, not been to the Kennedy Center yet.
Oh, okay. My apologies. But all kinds of different awards for individual projects and lifetime achievements. So why is the Oscar that you earned earlier this year different from other awards? What do awards have meaning to you at this point in your career?
Well, sure. Everybody likes to have an award, and particularly an Oscar. But I'd been nominated before for the Oscar 3 times for Best Director, and for films that were nominated as best film. But we didn't win those. We won other things, or I didn't win. I mean, we won Best Actress and that kind of thing, Best Screenplay, but we never won Best Picture or Best Director. But on this, I think for me, it was the fact that I had done that on my own. I mean, I was alone, and I wrote that screenplay, and it was totally, when I started out, unexpected. I never ever thought that it was going to all end up in that kind of way.
Okay. So Call Me By Your Name, it's going to be screened tonight at 6 o'clock at Pelican Cinemas with a Q&A session following with Mr. James Ivory. What do you hope that people get from the film, Call Me By Your Name? What from the story and from the film, what would you like people to remember from this film, or what do you hope that people interpret from it?
Well, it's a story about love and feeling and family love, and I hope that appeals to people. It so far has everywhere. So
now, at age 90, you haven't retired yet, because I know that there's future projects that you're still planning. I did see Richard II was one that you're working on, right?
Yes, it's Shakespeare. I've always wanted to do that particular play as a film, and we've been trying to raise the money for it for 4 or 5 years now, without success. It may never happen. At the moment, I'm writing a screenplay for Alexander Payne, based amazingly and by some curious coincidence on a story that came out in the New Yorker by Ruth Prawer. And he came to me and asked me to adapt that story into a screenplay, and it's going to be made by Fox. So Fox Searchlight. So that's what I'm doing at the moment. That's what I'm doing up at Lake of the Woods. I mean, I'm not out water skiing or anything. I'm in fact in my cabin writing.
Fantastic. Well, we will close this out because we have a film screening to get to that I'm very excited about. But I did want to note that you are not the only filmmaker that has come out of the Klamath Falls area. You certainly got a head start on some others, but there's a very prestigious documentarian at USC. There's a filmmaker in New Mexico. Bergen Swanson is someone who grew up here, who is a line producer who worked on films like Wild and 3 Billboards Outside Ebbing, Missouri, who also is in New York. So in the various award ceremonies and things, have you had chance encounters with some of the Klamath native filmmakers that have also gone on to Hollywood success? Is it like a little exclusive club?
No, I haven't. And there was someone from the University of Oregon who won an Oscar for his best, and I voted for him for a documentary. I never met him or had any idea he was from Oregon and all the rest of it. No, well, in the first place, I mean, pretty much directors don't mingle socially. I don't know why that is. I think that has been my experience in life. And I mean, I've known many, many directors. I'm friendly with about 4 or 5, but you don't mingle. You're on another trajectory or something of your own. You're out there so you don't really get together and talk and stuff.
So for those in the Klamath Basin now who are thinking that someday maybe they would like to get into this industry, as someone who has come from this area and found great success, any words of inspiration to pass along for those seeking to follow in your footsteps?
Well, be true to yourself. Don't do stuff that you don't really like or that you don't believe in or believe. Just be true to yourself and be true to your particular idea of a film and try to get your way on everything. And you may end up successfully.
Fantastic. Well, James Ivory is a Klamath native, Klamath Union High School graduate, and iconic filmmaker who earlier this year won an Oscar Academy Award for Best Screenplay for the film.
No, wait, you're waiting. There are 2 best screenwriters.
Oh, okay.
Best adapted and best original.
Okay.
So this is an adapted screenplay.
And best adapted screenplay. Thank you for the correction. So Call Me By Your Name will be screened today at 6 o'clock at Pelican Cinemas. Tickets are still available, and there will be a special Q&A session with Mr. James Ivory afterwards. Thank you so much for taking some time out to speak with us. I really appreciate it.
It was fine and enjoyable. Liked it.